And we're live.
Hey,
Daniel.
Hey, Jacob.
Looking very Hemingway-esque today. Drinking your Papa Doble cocktails.
I try. I'm down here at Rosemary Beach. Decided to do the live stream remote in a beautiful whitewashed facility here.
That is not a virtual background. It's an
no,
actual
it is not.
place.
It is real. Oh,
it's like doing it in Greece or somewhere, like in Santorini, with like the like sheer white architecture and the blue roofs and everything like that. What a nice place! What a nice place. Well, beautiful. Joining us from the beach, hanging out. What a significant level of dedication. It's Friday, everybody. Apparently there was a big game you were telling me about Alabama, Georgia.
Yeah, fantastic game.
I'm not a college guy. I'm an NFL guy. You're a college guy.
Roll Tide.
Apparently everybody was excited. It's postseason baseball. The Padres are about to play the Dodgers, which is our World Series, trying to beat those people because Shohei's getting paid $750 gajillion or something like that. So that's going to be super fun. There's a bunch of stuff happening. But first, like we always do every Friday, live stream Q&A about CMMC. And man, it is heating up. So not only are you trying to get a vacation and then trying to work in the live stream, but your inbox is literally melting at this point, is what you were telling me earlier.
Insane. And I was really hoping, I'm like, by the way, little Shaq Scott, Roll Tide back to you. Yeah. I really thought the rule was going to drop when I'm here at the beach, right? I mean, I'm like, my luck, I try and take a little time, little R&R, the rule's going to drop. And it actually didn't happen, which we'll talk about a little bit this week. But it's been really nice to like at least have a little bit of time off, but my inbox is melting. Like I thought I could get away and have a little break. But I mean, I think the last count I have is 49 flagged emails to address this weekend when I get back from vacation. So if you're one of those listening today, my apologies. I've been on the beach reading a great new book that I picked up, a little Warren and Bill, a little Warren Buffett, Bill Gates relationship. So that's always an interesting read, but yeah, it's still crazy out there.
Awesome. Yeah, usually taking R&R is a great way for the R&R to stand for rules and regulations, but you dodged the bullet. So good job. All right, well, let's jump into it so you can get back to the last hours of your vacation here. So like we always do, we'll just start with sort of what you're thinking about this week. What were you thinking about this week on the beach, Daniel? Did it happen to be regulated research enclaves?
It sure might be. So last week, before I actually took off on this vacation, I had multiple universities reaching out to me, which is not uncommon. The fact that it all happened in a week was pretty unusual. I think Georgia Tech might have something to do with that. But we were talking across multiple of these universities about the difficulties of regulated research enclaves, right? And the hard part, as you can imagine, is not really the technical piece, although that is definitely a component to it when you have lab equipment and things like that. The real hard nut to crack is the governance structure. Who has the stick to get people in line? Because grad students will go rogue. They'll go apply for a grant without anybody knowing. They'll get approval and funding from their sponsors. And then they're going to go spin up an AWS instance or an Azure instance or GCP and start doing this research with controlled and classified information that is not within a regulated research boundary, right? And so that happens way more often than you think. And it becomes problematic, right? Because now the university as a whole is still responsible for maintaining that because they've in part signed the contract and they're using assets that belong to the university. And so we were kind of working through this a little bit. It's like, hey, like technical, we can solve that to a degree, but really what we have to focus on is the governance structure because little known fact that I learned this from my friends in this space, it's very hard to fire people or to reprimand people at a higher ed level. And so, if people do something wrong, the slap on the wrist, that's about all you get. So my recommendation, try and build a governance, a central organization, the CIO's office, a CISO's office, something like that oversee all departments, all schools and their enclaves, or centrally manage all enclaves collectively. And then just kind of lease out that space to all of the different departments, schools, grad students, et cetera. But yeah, it is a very, very large problem. And I know you pulled up the CCP findings. I mean, there's a lot of non-U.S. persons in the mix as well. So not only do we have CMMC and DFARS 7012 requirements, but once you start mingling export control data in there, with non-US researchers without appropriate licensing, it becomes very, very problematic and a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, absolutely. There's two things come to my mind when you're talking about it. One is this CCP on the Quad report that came out, which if anybody hasn't read it, you can just Google CCP on the Quad and you'll find the report from the select committee on the CCP. And they analyzed, I think they looked at like 8,000 different research papers from the higher education ecosystem where American researchers and stuff like AI, advanced composites, nuclear energy are collaborating with blacklisted PRC entities. And there's all these gaps where, the same type of information would be banned from being exported. It would be export control data to the PRC, but through various failures and loopholes, collaboration on that information is allowed to happen with entities who would not be allowed to get that information exported to them via other means. So it's definitely an interesting report. You should read through it. It's not exactly a calming beach read, but it is very informative. The other thing that comes to my mind when we talk about higher education space is the FAR CUI rule, which we've talked about before, and the implications there, because there are lots of categories of CUI that higher education institutions handle other than just DoD specific information and defense research, which means that these higher education enterprises are going to have a lot of issues trying to bring their systems in line, even with just 800-171, because of all of these technical and organizational debts that are kind of on steroids in the higher education space. So
collaboration and compliance don't traditionally go hand in hand, and that's Brad made a comment. University space like herding cats, basically, and that's really what it is. The problem is that a new cat shows up on your doorstep every day that you have to herd, right? And so it's like that's where all the researchers and come into play. It's like, oh, we've got a new grant that somebody signed off on that we got from the DoD to fund this type of research. It's like, why didn't anybody know about this until it's already too late? So I feel you on that, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, for my quick week in review here, I'm just going to recap what we talked about on the podcast. So we had a whole podcast episode on Thursday about the fact that the Project Spectrum Cyber Readiness Check self-assessment tool no longer calculates a score when you go through all of your answers for 800-171 and 800-171A, because apparently, according to Project Spectrum, in an email that they sent, they have temporarily removed the score on the readiness checks in order to address possible confusion as to what the score represents. I don't know what that means. Yeah, I don't know what that means. I thought that's what the training was for, but they no longer have a tool on the Project Spectrum website that calculates your score. So if you log into the website to use their various assessment tools, and you go through the questionnaire, like the one for 800-171 here, typically we've given props to Project Spectrum, because as you go through,
great.
As you go through, now this isn't formatted exactly, the same way that 171 is formatted, but going through the tool will ask you all of the questions that are contained in 800-171A. And most importantly, what used to happen was if you answered no for a certain set of questions, you wouldn't get the overall points for the corresponding requirement in the end. So it would accurately calculate your score, unlike a lot of tools, which will just give you full points without, asking you the determination statements in 171A. Now, however, what you end up getting is you just end up getting this. You just end up getting a massive unformatted spreadsheet with your column of what answers you had and the questions. You don't actually get a score. So it's not very helpful. The alternative, though, the one sort of bright light here, is that DoD, actually the DIBCAC team itself, has, let me pull it up here, get rid of this.
Because that was my question. It's like, I used to send so many people to Project Spectrum and say, hey, go here, get your baseline. And now why would I send anybody there?
So if you want a free tool that is officially released from the government, you go to the DIBCAC website. You can just Google DIBCAC and you'll end up here. And you have to pick the 800-171 self-assessment database.
Can you zoom in on that one there? Let's see.
Sure.
Let's see. There we go.
Right.
Enhance.
Right here. Enhance. Right here.
Mm.
The self-assessment database, which they don't really talk about very much. The DibCAC's out there running JSVAs. They're doing their thing. They're not really talking about this stuff all that often. And if you download that, you end up with this.
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
What year is it? Now, we'll make fun of it, for the way it looks and the way it handles and all that other stuff. However, to be fair, if you end up going in and looking at what they have here.
Wait. Is this an access database?
This is an access database file.
I was just making sure. I thought that's what that was.
This is an access database. Ask your parents, kids. This is an access database. Now, to be fair to the access database, all of the information that you need is technically in this database, right? So you can go through for each of the assessment objectives, for each of the requirements in 800, 171, and 171A. It even gives you a little hint about the kind of thing that DibCAC might look for when they're going through the assessment. And most importantly, if you do not satisfy all of the assessment objectives for a given requirement, then the requirement satisfied here will not be checked and you won't get the corresponding number of points that the requirement stands for. So when you go over to the other part of the database that can generate reports, which it can generate quite a few different reports, then when you end up getting your score, brace yourselves, everybody.
Gosh.
When you get your score, it will calculate the score correctly, which means if you were going to upload something to SPRS and you used this tool from the DoD, you would technically get the accurate score by using this tool, but you can no longer get the accurate score from Project Spectrum because apparently it was too confusing. And if you were confused about that, I'm sure that this one won't confuse you, but there is a free option for people who want it.
I would like to allocate my taxpayer money to DibCAC just to make this a little bit better. I mean, it's functionally it looks great, but I mean, what are we, war games? Like that's what the dashboard looks like.
There's potential, but yeah, as of right now, if you want a full-blown free tool, then you gotta check it out. We go into the whole thing here on the podcast this week, so if you guys want more details, you can check out that episode.
True.
All right, let's see here. So we had a question that came in via DM last week, so maybe we kick this off and then we'll get to the questions that are live in the chat. So somebody said, can we have non-US employees in our GCC High environment and still be compliant?
We get this question a lot. We work with a lot of very large organizations and then a lot of organizations on the manufacturing side that have to bring in non-US persons as part of their facilities that they have. So long story short, yes. So you can have non-US persons in GCC High. You can technically have them in GCC. However, GCC, you can't hold export control data. So that kind of problem goes away, if you will. GCC High, you can hold export control data. And all contractually Microsoft's agreeing to is that they will not have non-US persons on their side of the fence, right? Supporting the tenant. However, you, through permissions, through what they call ABAC, attribute-based access control, you can set up and govern an environment where non-US persons and US persons sit in the same tenant. You just restrict their ability to access. Now, one layer above that, when you start looking at IT admins, global admins, people with any kind of administrative capability that would give them the ability to see export control data, that's where the problems start really happening. Because outside of going and getting export control licenses for these people, you basically just cannot have them as administrators in your tenant any longer if they have the ability to access export control data. If they're just accessing Intune information that doesn't have the ability to remote connect or query information that is export control, that's one thing. But if they're administering Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, again, anything with the ability to actually see that information, that's where it becomes problematic. So long story short, you can have it in there, but you have to have a very, very robust governance structure in order to make sure that that happens without being in violation of ITAR or EAR.
Gotcha. Well, we had one other one that came in that seemed related because it kind of comes up one right after the other. So maybe we'll jump into that one really quickly. Then we'll jump into the live questions. And it had to do with cross-cloud collaboration. So we get cross-cloud collaboration questions all the time. So maybe just at a high level, we talk about how useful is it. And then I'll bring up your diagram that you have here.
Okay, perfect. So Cross-cloud collaboration is a function that was released by Microsoft July of 2023, I think is what it was. It might have been 22 in GA, general availability. So what this allows you to do is it allows you to connect GovCloud to GovCloud, GovCloud to commercial, GovCloud to GCC, even GovCloud to the DoD M365 instance, which is really cool. And the things you can do with that is with Teams, you can direct one-on-one message, you can channel message, group message, collaborate across all those different channels there, co-author documents in SharePoint, gain access to documents in SharePoint, same with OneDrive. But one of the functions that people ask for all the time is not available, what they call in the cross-sovereign cloud world, and that is GalSync. So a lot of people want a unified address book. Microsoft does not have the ability to do that between both non-gov clouds and gov clouds. So if you're looking for that unified presence, you could say, of a single contact in an address book to message or email, whether that's Teams and then Exchange, that is not there yet. There are some kind of quirky workarounds that if you want to dive deeper in that, feel free to reach out to me. Where you can do some things with Intra ID Connect and transforming users into contacts and, transforming the external identity and all that kind of fun stuff. But right now, the feature is there. It does require a trust to be built on both tenants. So both the gov tenant and a commercial or another gov tenant. So it's two different, configurations there. But once that bridge is set up, you can actually have data flowing between these collaboration platforms. And then you want to make sure that, again, going back to governance, that you have appropriate purview labels in place, that you're making sure that people accessing it are compliant, right? Your actual users that you're trusting, because you can just allocate, maybe these 10 people need to be able to go across to this other cloud, so forth. But yeah, it's a really great tool for general collaboration. The one piece that we're waiting on to really make it great is that GalSync, and it's just not there yet for us.
Gotcha. All right, well, let's see here really quickly. So a couple questions came in about the rule. What do you know? So Vince asked, where is the rule?
Where is the rule?
Where is the rule? Sean asked, what is taking so long to publish the 32 CFR rule in the Federal Register? Isn't that a necessary step to start the 60-day legislative review period? Yes. So as we've talked about before, so once you get through the milestone of the rule being sent over to OIRA for regulatory review, and then they get through their 90 to 120 day-ish period of final review prior to publication, the rule then goes over to the Office of the Federal Register, yet another office in the massive bureaucratic machine. And they have, I think, 30 days technically to be able to publish the rule. Now, typically, a rule will be published much, much faster than that, like a week, maybe two. The problem is that we're at the end of the year and we're at the end of an election cycle, which means that everyone and their brother is trying to get rules published all at once. There's a massive spike in the last year of every administration getting rules published, getting, I's dotted and T's crossed and so on and so forth. So there's a backlog for when the rules can be published. The problem is, and this is what I was joking about on LinkedIn the other day, is that if I were in charge and king for a day, I would make the Office of the Federal Register have a dashboard like OIRA has. On the OIRA dashboard, you can see every rule that they're currently reviewing, when they got it, how long they've had it, which agency it came from, the history of what the rule has been doing, how many times it's been in the unified agenda. You can find all that information. And it's a pretty good way of keeping a general track of what's going on. We have no such dashboard for the Office of the Federal Register, so it's just a black box. And everybody that I've talked to at various agencies about rulemaking over the years, they don't know either. Because once they send it out into the ether and it's done, it's just in the system. They might get a heads up like the night before, but nobody really knows. Like, they don't have a status tracker for what's going on. So it's in the system. It's pending publication. We don't know. I was pretty confident that it would have been done by the end of September, with the caveat that we don't know how long the backlog is. So I would assume that it'll be by October 11th. I can't imagine that it would take much longer than that, but we just don't know. We just don't know how big the backlog is. But that's the only thing that would be keeping it from getting published, is how long that backlog is. But is the rule required to start the legislative review period? Yes, the legislative review period starts from the publication of the rule, essentially. And so that period will start once it is published. But we don't know. It's with OFR, and it'll get published when they get to it, I guess.
Do we have any idea how many people even work there? Like, is this like a real small team, or is this?
Well, I mean, OIRA only is a team of, maybe a couple dozen people. I mean, these are not massive organizations. OMB and OIRA are pretty small. I would be surprised if OIRA was more than 45 people top to bottom. Wow. And that's for the regulatory review side. The Office of the Federal Register, I honestly don't know. If anybody knows, let us know in the chat. OFR, if you're watching the stream, stop and go publish the rule.
Right,
and
please.
You can go back next week. But yeah, I don't know how many people work at OFR, but OIRA is a very, very small team, which when you think about what OMB and OIRA are responsible for,
it's a bottleneck. That's an insane bottleneck.
Yeah, they definitely hold the keys to the kingdom here. All right, let's see here. So we talked about cross cloud. So something that came in when it comes to, let me take Sean's off here. Something else that came in. Last week we talked about the questions that we often ask companies when they're talking about migrating and doing their migrations. It was actually a pretty popular clip that got put out there. Pretty insightful for a lot of people, both insightful and insightful. INCITEFUL. Did I spell that right? I hope I got it right. You know what I'm saying? So one of the questions that came in is, okay, so there's all these issues that have to get taken care of, but like what actually happens? How do companies actually train their employees to do this shift from commercial over to GCC High? Because it's not like you just wake up one day and then you're in there, right? There are some issues that you got to be aware of.
I mean, you're looking at things like re-enrolling mobile devices, right? Doing that, potentially re-enrolling computers if they're direct join with Intune into intra-ID joins. You're looking at resetting up guest accounts, right? So when you go to the GovCloud, we just talked about B2B. Now you might need, in order to have that same capability, to build a trust between your partner tenants and your own tenant, right? So you can collaborate on those documents again. Well, there's another gotcha there, right? Because now you need to make sure with your supply chain team are the people who are actually allowing to collaborate accepted the DFARS 7012 flow down, right? So there's some policy work that has to be done and procedure work that has to be done to make sure that your what we call visitor management components of guest users are checking the box appropriately. You're looking at simple things like setting up Outlook, resetting up Teams, resyncing OneDrive and SharePoint libraries. And then some seamless things that should happen in the background are configuration of their single sign-on applications, right? So that should be done by IT, just pointing them to the new location for Intra-ID in the GovCloud. But again, you start peeling this back. I mean, it could easily take a user, 1 to 3 hours to kind of get reset back up into a stable state so they can continue to work. Now, luckily, there's some good things with like hybrid join. That's an easy move versus a direct join. That the user is kind of transparent to even knowing anything happened. But yeah, I mean, there's several things they need to know around what do I need to set up day one. And then the one thing that's most impactful for people going to GCC High is my external users now have to open a Teams meeting in a web browser because the Teams thick client app doesn't typically join. And my guest users, I have to go ahead and set up a trust between them, which you can do proactively, which IT has to do. External Microsoft forms no longer work. So you can use internal Microsoft forms, but externals don't work. So if you have forms for intake, things like that, for like onboarding a new vendor or a new employee that don't yet have a named account inside of your environment, that you'll have to look to substitute that to like a Survey Monkey or some kind of tool of that nature. So yeah, there are definitely several kind of significant changes. My recommendation after going through this a lot, communicate consistently, do lunch and learns, do video recordings, publish them out. If you have like a know before instance, you can upload and validate to some extent that they've watched those things. That would be ideal. But users will be users, and come day of, chances are a good significant portion of them will have not read what they need to read in order to be prepared. So also just have a good support team and kind of a go live hotline they can call, right, when something does happen, or help, I can't log in, or things like that. So there's a lot of nuances to all that. That's just kind of broad stroke, kind of what to expect when expecting, at least on the user side. But it's a lot of organizational change management, a lot of education.
Wait just a second.
I know.
Hold on.
I know.
You're telling me that there's no easy button that we press that just switches us over to this new environment, and that we just keep on trucking the way that we've always been trucking. Because I was told this takes 2 weeks. I was told this takes 2 weeks and like $20. What's the big deal?
If I had $1 for every time somebody asked me, can't Microsoft just flip a switch? I would have gone ahead and bought this Airbnb here at Rosemary Beach that I'm staying in, because Microsoft, there is no path there. Completely different data centers. Like the two worlds just don't even really communicate to each other. So yeah, this is not a 2-week thing. This is a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 month thing. I mean, I work with some companies that are, tens of thousands of employees. And I kid you not, we've been working on this plan for 3 to 4 years to get them into the Gov Cloud, just because it's that much of a lift. So yeah, if you're a company of any kind of decent size, this conversation and this kind of strategic planning should probably have started about 6 months ago. If you're looking to make a move in the next 6 months, if not, you need to start today, right? When's the best time to plant a tree? 20 years ago or today, right? Isn't that what they say?
Yeah.
You need to get on it. You need to really kind of dive in, figure out what integrations you're using, figure out what external apps you're using, figure out all the dependencies, how your users are using the platform. And then the hard part is where there isn't feature parity in the Gov Cloud where there was in commercial. Maybe you've rolled out Copilot. Fantastic. I'm so happy for you. Guess what? We don't have it in GCC High, right? So now there's a shift to users thinking they're going backwards a step when it comes to certain things, and recalibrating those expectations. So
yeah,
I wish it was just 2 weeks. It'd make my job a lot easier, but it's a multi-month endeavor, not only to plan, scope, but also to execute and then cut over.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of planning, so we've seen this come up in some public comments. We've seen this come up over the years in various conversations. Now it's coming up in questions, and it comes down to the cost of assessment when people are planning things out. And I've seen this occurring again in the comments, saying that assessments are going to cost $100,000. I remember years ago when somebody found a quote allegedly saying that their CMMC assessment was going to cost $100,000, and it just went viral everywhere. And now everyone is convinced that a CMMC assessment will cost $100,000 for a small business inside the 32 CFR rule. That is not what the DoD estimates. No. And we talk with people about this all the time, and that's not what we're seeing either. No. We are not a C3PAO, but the folks that we talk to, it's not even close to $100,000.
No. I mean, we work with partners all the time. I mean, a few of them being like CyberSec Invest or CyberSec, Align is another one, A-Lign, and several other ones kind of on our list of preferred partners that we have. But I mean, we're looking at like maybe 20 to 40K, somewhere in that range for a traditional small business. Now, here's the thing. In reality, this is going to be a supply and demand thing once the rule is published. So, I mean, those rates will probably go up. But I haven't talked to anybody, at least currently, that is anticipating $100,000 assessment for a small business of, let's say, sub 100 employees, right? Yeah. So I would say, that 20 to 40 range is way more realistic for sub 50, sub 100 shops with 1, maybe 2 facilities at tops. And then after that, I mean, I have heard of $80,000 to $100,000 figures for, the enterprises of the world that have significant scope, assets, things to validate, right? Because if you have 37 different variants of configuration baselines across 1,000 distros of Linux and Windows and Mac, and the complexity just starts kind of ticking up on that from an assessment approach. So yeah, I would say 20 to 40 if you have a relatively simplistic environment with 1 or 2 sites, sub 100 people. If you would like a list of our assessors that we partner with, feel free to shoot me a message on LinkedIn, and we can get that information out.
Yeah, and if anybody has questions specific to the C3PAOs, what's going on, what they're seeing, then you can message us in the chat. You can message us separately or reach out. We're going to have on the podcast in 2 weeks, in mid-October, we're going to have one of the C3PAOs on to talk about what they've seen in JSVAs. Nice. And the fact that they are now booked out until May of 2025 for their full assessment capacity. So supply and demand will be not very helpful for folks that didn't schedule their assessment ahead of time, which you have to be implemented to qualify for the assessment in order to qualify to schedule the assessment, which gets back to your point earlier about if you want to be ready to go in 6 months, you should have started 6 months ago. So start as soon as possible so that you can get in line and not get punished by the supply and demand issues unnecessarily.
So we have, is Vincent Defense Cybersecurity Group here? Is that he put in here, not what they're seeing either. They're seeing 25 to 75K based on the size of the business. So yeah, that definitely lines up.
Yeah. Yeah. It's somewhere in that neighborhood for sure. But yeah, I mean, I could see why you could get to 100K for a massive enterprise, but the average DIB contractor is not going, they're not going to see that level at all. Okay. Let's see here. So Jack said, so talking about assessments, so in regards to CMMC assessment, having a C3PAO assess the OSC, which is Organization Seeking Certification.
Also OSA, if for those
Organization Seeking Assessment in the rule. Yeah. So if you're seeking a cert, you are an OSC. How do we know what is the gold standard and what is good enough if the C3PAOs are not all created the same? One company can pass the OSC and another may not. Yeah, there is variability in the approach and opinions of various C3PAOs. So do your research and protect yourself at all times, just like you were in any other kind of boxing match. The boxing match that you might get in with a C3PAO. Now you're able to pick who your C3PAO is. This is not you getting assigned a team by DoD. This is not a random DIBCAC team coming up. And so you should be vetting how they think about stuff. Are they familiar with what you do? How do they think about what's going on? If you just throw a dart at the list of C3PAOs and pick somebody at random, you might be fine. It'll probably be relatively normal because they understand things as much as you do. But if you're worried about there being inconsistencies or edge cases or anything like that, do your research.
I tell people all the time, speed date, right? We actually joked about doing this at CS2, like a speed dating for C3PAOs. Because a great example, which we've talked about on the live stream a couple weeks ago, was like out of scope assets for virtual desktop. Where does that C3PO stand on that? What is their perspective of that? Because that's a little gray, murky area, right? So any kind of exemptions or nuances that you might have, I would just send that list of questions to each C3PO that you're talking to, just to see what their stance might be on that. Just to make sure that you are in alignment, and that if they're not in alignment, that you have appropriate artifacts to prove that, your case, if you will, come time of assessment. But definitely recommend that kind of speed dating approach, because like Jacob said, you get to pick who it is.
Yeah. And this implies that you're very familiar with what's going on, because theoretically your CMMC assessment, your assessment of 800-171 implementation should be a relative formality, because the level of thoroughness that you've used to conduct your self-assessment to calculate your score that you've uploaded to SPRS would utilize the same amount and type of evidence that an external assessor would use. Now, there might be some questions, there might be additional things that you have to do here and there, but for you to determine the score and have assurance that something is implemented should be relatively similar to the level of assurance that is required for an external assessor. That's the advantage of using NIST requirements as the basis for this program, because we're using a standardized set of determination statements to determine whether a control is being implemented, unlike ISO or SOC or some of the other approaches where the questions are just in the assessor's head and what they ask may not be the same, but you have some ability here to pick who you're going to tie your fate to. So it's very, very important that you do your research and vet accordingly. All righty, let's see. So Evan asked, the DoD published a new cybersecurity FAQ on the Procurement Toolbox website back in June. How authoritative is this doc? Can we stand behind it during discussions with prime assessors, etc.? Yes, you can. The DoD Procurement Toolbox Cybersecurity FAQ is official DoD CIO guidance on all kinds of stuff in the FAQ regarding the various requirements. Now, that being said, before you guys start frothing in the chat, you may find inconsistencies between what the FAQ says and what other guidance says. You may find inconsistencies between what the FAQ says and what the NIST controls sometimes explain. You may find various wrinkles and gaps, and that has been par for the course since. You got to pull it. You pull it up here.
I did. I pulled it up. So just for people who are unaware of this, so the DoD Procurement Toolbox, I'll kind of zoom in a little bit, has a cybersecurity dropdown. You can go to FAQs, then you have to click on FAQs on the left. I don't know why. And then you actually launch this PDF with 100, maybe 200 questions now of general questions around cybersecurity, DFARS clauses, 7012, flow down. Like a good example here, do cloud service providers have to follow DFARS 7012 if there's a breach inside the hosted VM? Right? That's a good question that you might want an answer to. And so this is the DoD's stance in response to all of these things. So we'll drop the link here in chat, just so you guys can have a copy of it, but it is most definitely worth checking out and a great tool to use to defend your position on how things are configured and or not configured to be compliant, right? So like, hey, I don't think I have to do this because the procurement toolbox says X, Y, and Z, right? So yeah, very much so.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's see here. Ned said, have you found any issues with the gap analysis spreadsheet on the CMMI Information Institute? I think he meant CMMC Information Institute, Jim Gopal's website. I'm not familiar with that spreadsheet. I am familiar with CMMC Information Institute and with Jim's stuff. He seems to put out good information. So I haven't had a chance to look at it, but we'll definitely look into it in more detail. Off the top of my head, I generally believe things that Jim has to say. He's been around the space for a long time and puts out good information. So I haven't checked it out, but if anybody has thoughts, if anybody's used it, let us know in chat. Have you had a good experience? Do you like the tool? Do you like the template? But I haven't personally taken a look at it, but I'll add it to my list, Ned. Thanks for linking that. Let's see here. So Mike had a comment about the DibCAC access database that everybody loves. See if I can pull this back up in all its glory. He said, I've used the access tool. It works, but very clunky, not what you would expect. It's not enterprise worthy. It gets the job done.
That's right.
I don't know if it's a long-term solution, but we have, we use FutureFeed as our partner for folks that are going to work with us, and they have no problems calculating their score. They have no problems tracking what's going on. They have no issues on the GRC side of managing GRC stuff. But it's not free. So if you want a free tool, this is what you get.
What you got.
And like Mike said, from his experience, it's not necessarily enterprise worthy, not a movie quality Chewbacca mask here. All right. Saz said, I thought that was a Padres logo at first in the bottom corner. Go Padres.
Got you real excited, didn't it?
Yeah, it got me pretty excited. Saz said, how would I find out if my company is subject to CMMC at all? Automotive industry, but we just provide leads. What do you think, Daniel?
My short answer to that, if you're just like a housing company where you're just brokering one partner with another, as long as those RFPs that you're responding to get the leads are not considered CUI, I think it would be probably pretty hard to say that you would be subject to it. Now, it all kind of depends, again, back to data flow. If you're having DFARS 7012 and you're adhering to that and you are at any point signing that contract, there could be problems there and you will likely be required to fall into CMMC level 2. But yeah, if you're just a kind of a brokerage where you're just like, here's a lead here, I'm putting them in contact with this vendor, I think you're probably safe. However, if you're representing and white labeling their products as your own, and you're actually the one delivering the goods or services, you would likely be in scope for that. So it kind of depends on the use case of what you're looking at here, on whether or not that may or may not flow down to you. If it's what they call a COTS product, consumer off the shelf, very likely it's not going to apply. But if it's something that's custom built for the DoD, then chances are it would be in scope, again, depending on the parts that you're supplying as part of this. But DFARS 7012, that's your first indicator. Look at your contracts, and if you're executing them, that's again, that leading indicator that you're probably going to have to adhere to CMMC.
Yeah, good point. All right, some people were asking about the scoring system for controls, the scoring system for 800-171. So if you're curious, I'll put the link in chat here in a second. If you want the official version for CMMC scoring now adopts the DoD assessment methodology scoring. They are the same. This makes sense because they're both representative of DoD policy for how to weight the various requirements in 800-171. If you want the answer from the 32 CFR proposed rule from December of 2023, you can check out section 170.24, the CMMC scoring methodology, down towards the bottom of the rule. And this will tell you which of the requirements are worth which point values in 800-171. This is the same as if you Google the DODAM, DODAM, DOD assessment methodology. That's where you can find a breakdown of the scores. Obviously, the problem being this is not a tool that allows you to calculate your score based off your implementation. It's just text that tells you what they're worth, which is why people need to rely on stuff like the DIBCAC Access database or a tool that they pay money for in order to calculate it. But this is an involved process. And the score that you calculate is an attestation to the government. And DIBCAC auditors have found consistently over the years that people wildly mess up the calculation of their scores, and that when they show up to ask questions against 800-171A, the actual scores have a delta of like 100 points less than what people self-assess themselves against. So if you want to know the details of the CMMC scoring, check it out in the 32 CFR proposed rule, specifically section 170.24. All righty, let's see here. So Samantha, hi Samantha. Samantha asked great questions as the thing that I've noticed in our short time doing this segment here every week. So thanks, Samantha. Samantha asked, once you are migrated to GCC or GCC High, what are the next best steps to take? What should this process look like?
Fantastic. So GCC High, once you migrate into it, that's great. However, just because you're in the tenant doesn't check the box on compliance. So if you haven't gone through the implementation of, Intune, conditional access policies, data loss prevention policies, Sentinel as a SIM deployment, right? If you haven't, EDR for endpoint or Defender for endpoint, if you haven't gone through the actual configuration of the tenant to meet all of those controls, that's where I would say, hey, it's time for you to start that. If you have started that, now you're looking at adopting some of the follow-up policies and procedures that support that implementation. So think about your incident response plan, vulnerability management. How are you, writing the processes to review Sentinel logs? How often are you doing that? Are you doing it once a day, once a week, once a quarter, once a month? Going through and actually mapping the Microsoft technology stack to the way you're actually going to be kind of doing the IR and maintenance steps since you've now entered that process. Change control boards are huge, obviously, making sure that those are in place. But that's what I would say would be the biggest piece. Make sure the tenant's actually configured to meet the controls. If it is configured to meet controls, start building your procedures and policies to support that, pointing at those artifacts. Go ahead and proactively gather screenshots so you at least know where they are when the assessment is going to take place. And then make sure everything is documented for change control moving forward, because now you have a good baseline configuration documented. Now you need to go forth and just make sure that config document, that baseline, stays up to date moving forward. So any additional adds there, Jacob?
No, I think you got it all. So Joanna asked in regards to vetting and asking questions about C3PAOs. So Joanna, like I was saying earlier, in 2 weeks, we're going to have a podcast specifically with one of the busier C3PAOs out there in the ecosystem. And we'll be sure to ask them what they recommend for vetting C3PAOs, because they're out there and they see all kinds of stuff for preparation and things like that, for good assessments, bad assessments. There's a spectrum, just like everything else. I don't know if you have any thoughts here, Daniel, on how to think about asking what your C3PAO is going to be doing. We have a series of companies that, we are not a C3PAO because we do the implementation side, but we've worked with a lot of them, and they're not all created equal. So we've done our vetting for who we recommend, not because they're, an easy button, but because they're good at what they do. Do you have any thoughts here on maybe what we can ask in 2 weeks on the podcast?
Yeah, so I would ask, have they been through a joint surveillance assessment, right? Have they gotten some laps in as it comes to doing assessments, right? Or are they just new to the C3PAO game and they want to kind of branch out in this industry, right? So what's their past performance is a really, really big one. You're going to see those numbers being relatively low unless they've done gap assessments, because I don't think more than probably 80 to 100 joint surveillance assessments have happened. That might even be high. So that's one thing I would definitely look at. If you have physical sites, travel is another big piece, because for, at least according to the CAP today, they have to go on site and physically see certain aspects that have been implemented, locks on doors, cameras, things like that. So you want to talk to an assessor that has kind of warm bodies near you, or else your expenses of travel and things like that could go up as well. So that's another good caveat to consider as part of that. And then any nuances, kind of unique to your environment from a scoping perspective. So if you've gotten exemptions from the DoD CIO, if you have kind of a non-standard, what you would consider non-standard implementation of things, go ahead and just have that list, going back to that speed dating comment, and just kind of ask them, hey, how would you handle these 1, 2, 3 scenarios, and just see what they say, right? And that's kind of the approach that I would probably take, local as best as possible to save on expenses for travel, make sure that they've done assessments before and what their pass and or fail rate is, which isn't necessarily their fault, but good to know. And then any kind of nuances that are unique to your environment. Those are the three big ones I would probably ask.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me, so we were talking earlier this week, we talked to a lot of companies in the construction industry, because there's a lot of construction industry work that interfaces with defense work. And so, we see this a lot in terms of very specific issues that they face. So much like you would vet a service provider, you should probably also ask your potential assessment provider, if you will, if they're familiar with the peculiarities of the industry that you're in. So there might be folks that are very familiar with what's going on. They're established C3PAO. They've done a lot of assessments. So they may have never done a C3PAO assessment for a construction firm, which may have different considerations. So what do you see when it comes to this stuff, Daniel? Because you talk to construction firms a lot. They deal with a lot of controlled data, but they're not generally as aware as like the traditional aerospace manufacturing shop.
No, and that's kind of the tricky part. So I spoke at a conference a couple weeks ago that was just construction companies here in Northern Alabama, which we have Redstone Arsenal here in Huntsville, and that's a very large military base for those that may not know. And so they were kind of sitting in a room at a hotel next to the Space and Rocket Center, and we were just talking, and they're like, wait, this is going to apply to me? I know in the public comment that they posted on 48 CFR, I think it was a builders association, said that 82% of construction companies are less than 10 people, right? And it's just like that information is not getting down to them. They're not as in tune with it as, traditional defense contractors, right? They're multiple steps removed from the supply chain from that level of engagement. And so when you start looking at that, it's really, really important to make sure that everyone is filtered down this information, that you're telling your subs and you're telling your subs to tell their subs, and you kind of keep that going down, because it's great if you maybe get one level deep in your supply chain and they're okay. But once you get, tier 2, tier 3 and kind of keep going down, that's where the real risk is, because talking to people either fresh on the manufacturing side or on the construction side, neither of those from a small business have typically heard that this is coming. And that's going to be a problem here in the next, few weeks to few months, because they might not really exist anymore. I mean, they were telling me at this conference, hey, I think we're just going to have to no longer do defense work and have to get rid of half of our employees, because we're going to have to focus on commercial stuff, because we don't have, $50,000 to $100,000 on the low end to be able to do all of this, right? If an assessment's, let's say $30,000, kind of split the difference there, and implementation is $50,000, you're closely pushing $100,000 for a 10-person company. We call it the 6-figure problem here at Summit 7. And they have to be prepared for that. And most aren't. Yeah. So anyways, that's where I stand with that one.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And this brings up something that we were talking about on LinkedIn earlier. We've been monitoring the public comments that have been coming in. And recently, from the construction industry directly, there have been a series of public comments that have been submitted on the 48 CFR proposed rule. That's the rule that will put CMMC level requirements in your contracts via the DFARS 7021 contract clause specifically. And if you go to the public comments, which are public, you can find them on regulations.gov. A couple things here. One is the Associated Builders and Contractors industry group for the construction industry seems to have given everyone a form letter for submitting a comment on the proposed rule. Now, all of this is the form letter that multiple people are all submitting from the construction industry. A quick note here. We've done a podcast on this in the past about how to submit effective public comments. And the number one thing from the guidance from the government for submitting public comments that sticks out to me is that public comments are not a vote, right? And so one carefully crafted public comment will outweigh 100 form letters that all say the same thing. The amount of the same thing being said doesn't necessarily tally up support or dissent from the regulation, right? So that's the thing to know. You can see this when what people are doing, and this example is that they are appending their individual thoughts on top of the form letter. And so when you actually dig into the comments aren't actually saying much. They're saying, oh, we need more clarity. This comment just says this is another way to destroy small and mid-sized businesses with overregulation. This comment, the totality of the comment is just, please clarify.
Oh my gosh.
It's great to see that everyone's participating, not knocking that. I'm just saying that check out our podcast episode on effective comments. I'll go through here in a second and add it into chat so everybody can see it, because there is a way to construct those comments other than just the form letter. Now, however, the form letter does make some decent points. We won't necessarily go into all the details, but one of the percentages that we were talking about earlier, Daniel, was the construction industry is largely comprised of small businesses, with 82% of all construction firms having fewer than 10 employees, and 81% of the industry employed by small business. Mm-hmm. And this is not unique to the construction industry.
No,
this is not unique to manufacturing. This is not unique to the defense industry. This is not unique to agriculture, energy, or anything else. Everything is small businesses in the supply chain. Once you get down to a certain tier, the DoD is very aware of the structure of the supply chain. And so, although this is very insightful, that isn't necessarily a thing that is going to change the nature of the regulation. The data is flowing into this small business environment, and the requirements are flowing along with it, which is an issue. But like we were talking about, when it comes to specific thoughts on specific thoughts on construction industry compliance, you're probably a small business. Your C3PAO may be familiar with working with small businesses, but they may not be familiar with the details of construction-based small businesses. So it's definitely
I'll give you an example, like Procore, or I've got a foreman that has to go take pictures of a job site, right? That might be a weird kind of unique case that not other industries have. Like, how are you doing that, right? Are you managing the device? Are you managing the way that they can take pictures on that? Or you have a policy set up to do that? Like, those nuances, if you can find somebody that's familiar with that, will help that assessment go so much smoother, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, one small side note on this, Jacob, because I know you've talked about it before. The reason it took so long to even get the 32 CFR rule in the first place is DoD routed this supposedly through small business, SBA.
That's right.
And here's the thing, like, I talk to people all the time, people are they're like, Congress is going to save us, right, during the 60-day review cycle. And it's like, number one, Congress told DoD to do this. Mm-hmm. So there's that. And DoD already did due diligence and routed this through Small Business Administration. And SBA checked the box and said, okay, next.
Yep.
So
absolutely.
I hate to say this, but right now there is no agency, no funding vehicle in the federal government that is looking to bail anybody out. When it comes to CMMC. And that's hard pill to swallow, but I just want to be really transparent with people there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I understand the sentiment, right? And you will see attrition from supply chains as a result of cybersecurity regulations, like you would with any other regulation, right? But that is the trade-off that comes with more assurance over the data flow in the supply chain. Like you said, just sit on, any of the calls, the many calls that we have every week, or just listen to the recent reports. There's more industry reports that are coming out. MXD had a report that came out a couple months ago. Merrill Research just released another one of their annual reports that was looking at cybersecurity compliance in the DIV. And there's single-digit levels of readiness among defense contractors for CMMC, which you might say, oh, that means that a lot of companies aren't going to make it. What that tells the DoD is that 90+% of contractors, we have no guarantee that they're implementing the requirements to protect our data, right? So that there's two sides to how you sort of read some of those takeaways in the analysis. But let me find the link here. I'll add it. You may have to find it after the stream if I can't dig it up, for the podcast episode on how to submit effective public comments. All right, let's see here. John had a question. Can you explain COTS product exclusions from DFARS 7012, CMMC 2.0 if building materials in a bid request from DoD are considered CUI? Does the materials requisition sent to suppliers have to be considered CUI? So sort of two different dynamics here. One is the COTS exclusion. The other is data you're receiving from the DoD in the bid process being CUI. So one of the concessions that the Department of Defense has made for industry has been a COTS exclusion. If you are exclusively a COTS supplier, which is a distinct definition, then you don't need to implement the requirements in DFARS 7012. You don't need a CMMC assessment to prove that you have implemented the requirements in 800-171. You are excluded if you are a COTS supplier. What I typically see is that people mess up the distinction between a COTS product and commercial items. Commercial items are not the same thing in the legal definition as a COTS product. You can't go down to Best Buy and buy this thing off of the shelf, right? It is not a commercial off-the-shelf product. The key language in this commercial item designation being that if you've made any modifications for the government to this product that is otherwise commercial, it might be a commercial item, but it is not a COTS item, and therefore you would not be excluded. However, my main recommendation is that if you're going to try to use this COTS commercial item designation to get out of the requirements, speak to an attorney who specializes in this specific type of work, because you're talking about legal definitions, you're talking about contract negotiations, you're talking about pushing back on primes, large primes, or the government itself. Typically, we see small businesses don't typically have the appetite or the resources to do that type of thing. And although it's clear enough when the average person reads the regulations, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you speak to somebody who specializes in navigating that type of work.
So I just shared back to the DoD procurement toolbox. They actually have a section on COTS products and when the DFARS 7012 clause would apply or not.
Perfect.
So, one item of note here.
Can you scroll up just a second? There you go.
I can. Yeah. So this is several paragraphs long, so I definitely recommend it. But when the acquisition of commercial items involves cover defense information, such as in some cases when commercial items, services, or offerings are tailored to meet a particular customer's requirements, 7012 is going to be applied. But then it goes up here and say, let's see here. If a commercial item must be modified to meet, such modification may require safeguarding of controlled defense information. COTS is a commercial item that's been sold in the commercial marketplace, like you said, Jacob, in substantial quantities. So again, that COTS delineation there. The clause is not required for solicitations and contracts solely for the acquisition of COTS items. So, there are several really good kind of just, pop outs here from this answer. It's the first question in the cybersecurity procurement toolbox because they get that a lot. Highly recommend taking a look at this. Again, as Jacob said, go meet with your legal counsel, lawyers, figuring out what you should flow down, things like that. But there is some general guidance here, more so than almost anywhere else that I found regarding consumer off-the-shelf items. So
absolutely.
Hope that helps.
Absolutely. All righty, let's see here. So we had a question come in a comment on one of our YouTube videos earlier. What do you think will happen with DFARS 7019 and 7020 when DFARS 7021 goes into effect? Will CMMC supersede the need to enter scores from DoD assessment methodology assessments into SPRS? Apologies to anybody new here who doesn't know what these numbers and acronyms mean. So what do you think will happen with these two clauses, DFARS 7019 and 7020? 7019 and 7020 were created in 2020 with the CMMC, original CMMC rule that was created. That rule actually did two things. It created the CMMC assessment methodology and what's known as the DoD assessment methodology. They're not very original in their naming here. They're essentially two different assessment approaches to the same set of requirements. One being run with private companies as C3PAO assessment organizations. The other one being run through self-assessments and DoD DIBCAC assessments that culminate in you calculating a score and uploading it to the supplier performance risk system known as SPRS, commonly referred to as your SPRS score, which is what we talked about earlier in the stream. That scoring methodology, 5 points, 3 points, 1 points for various controls in 800-171 is now the same between the DODAM, the DoD methodology, and CMMC, according to the proposed rule from December. So you might think to yourself, well, when the CMMC clause goes into effect and it says you need to get a CMMC assessment, why would we need DFARS 7019 and 7020 to say, go run a self-assessment and then upload the score if I'm getting the score from CMMC? It will not go away. You will have both of these things at the same time because they do two different things. One is that the DoD assessment methodology 7019 and 7020 provision and clause are not just making you calculate a score and upload it into SPRS. It's making you aware that you need to be available for DIBCAC to come and do an assessment if they deem it to be necessary, right? There's more language in those clauses than just calculating the score. As far as the question, will CMMC supersede the need to enter scores from the DoD assessment methodology? Supersede, I think, is maybe the wrong way to think about it. If you go through a CMMC level 2 assessment, according to the language in the proposed rule, your score from that assessment gets uploaded into SPRS. If you have otherwise uploaded a self-assessment score, that's a different score, right? That corresponds to your self-assessment of your implementation. So they won't go away. They complement each other is probably how the DoD would describe these clauses working together. However, under the hood, in practical terms, it's the same set of requirements. It's the same scoring system as far as how the requirements are weighted. The decisions for whether a control is implemented or not via 800-171A are the same. And so it might be considered duplicative. It might be considered complementary, but they will not replace, 7021 will not replace 7019 and 7020. Those are going to stick around for the foreseeable future as part of the whole thing that they tried to stand up in 2020. Let's see here.
Can we get one more question in? I think I've got a good one here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Mike said, if we are using a SaaS solution with CUI that is hosted on the GovCloud, but the vendor is not CMMC certified, what actions need to be taken to be compliant? We actually get this a lot. I think Jacob on the was it the podcast? Or maybe it was last week we talked about this kind of same question. If a product is sitting on top of a FedRAMP GovCloud, AWS, Azure, something like that, then that's great. The data center is compliant. However, the application is not also compliant with what they call FedRAMP, right? You can't inherit those controls. So if there is CUI in that SaaS application, the application itself, the SaaS app, has to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. Now, equivalent is very dicey. We've actually heard of people losing equivalency here recently. And so the data center, great on them for deploying to a FedRAMP data center, but their app still has to go through FedRAMP if it is a SaaS application. If it's an IaaS or a PaaS application, where it's something that you're hosting inside of an Azure Gov or an AWS Gov Cloud, that's actually technically in your boundary, and it just has to be configured to 171 for CUI, right? So if you go spin up a server inside of AWS Gov or Azure Gov, and you only have to apply the 110 controls, it doesn't have to go through FedRAMP because the data center's FedRAMP. So the only difference here is if a intermediary is hosting the application and running the application, the SaaS provider, they have to get FedRAMP, even though they're sitting on a FedRAMP data center. So the short of it, Mike, is there isn't a path forward unless they go through the FedRAMP authorization process or go through equivalency process. You would have to pull that data out and probably deploy it either on-prem or in your own cloud instance of Azure or AWS. There's not an easy way around this, or just remove CUI from it, right? I mean, which is potentially impossible depending on what the app is. Anyways, I just wanted to address that because that's a very common question that we get all of the time. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good question, Mike. Good seeing you again. Alrighty, well, that's an hour on a Friday. I think we got through a lot of questions this time. There's a couple other questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, so we'll front load those for next week. And then if you're watching this after the stream is over and you have questions, feel free to add them into the comments, either on YouTube or on LinkedIn, and we will catch them and then get them queued up for the following show next Friday as well. So only 11 days left to submit a comment on the 48 CFR rule, everybody. So if you have other comments that you'd like left, then make sure you put them on the rule. Follow best practice.
There you go. Have a good weekend, everybody.
See you, everybody. Bye.
Hey, roll Tide. See y'all.